Hello, everyone. Harry here. Welcome to another edition of Talking Books. Today we are talking with Dahlia Lithwick, known probably almost to everyone on who's listening, but she's the senior legal correspondent at Slate and host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning bi-weekly podcast about the law. Her works also appeared in basically every prominent national publication. She won a 2013 National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act, and she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in October 2018, which I'm here to tell you is a pretty big deal. So pleased to have hot off the presses the book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. Is it actually officially even published yet, Dahlia? We're taping today on 9/12, but is it out?
Pub date is September 20th. So by the
Okay.
time folks are listening, I
Listening
think
to
it is
this?
out. Yeah.
Yeah, it might even be sold. You guys better run because it might be sold out. Okay, so pretty evident from the title that it's about women lawyers, but let's zero in a little. Well, how would you describe the project, Dahlia, and why did you decide to embark on it in particular at this juncture in your career?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's very weird to be one-on-one with you. I'm used to being like on this huge panel where I have to like throw elbows and get a word in. So I'm
Yeah.
feeling like there's going to be weird silences when I'm just thinking. But
Yeah.
it's a book that I started writing just at the very beginning of the Trump era. And I think that the big animating feeling I had at the time was that women were really remarkably, from the advent of Trump's presidency, really interested in the law. And that women would like form lines at events to ask me about the emoluments clause, and they wanted to understand the Hatch Act. And I think I sensed that there was this real feeling, particularly among women, and I don't want to essentialize, and we can talk about that,
Yeah.
but that all of this edifice that we had taken for granted was just a bunch of like toilet paper norms. And that women, particularly, were just really interested in understanding like, wait, can Mitch McConnell really block Merrick Garland? Like, isn't there a law? Wait, can Trump's spokespeople really flack for Ivanka's, clothing chain? I guess so. And the people who seem most susceptible to like that feeling of shock that this is all just like norms and values was women. And maybe I'll just skip ahead to, the book quite literally had to get rewritten in the days after Dobbs, but that sort of arc, Harry, of like, oh my God, it's really none of this is as robust as we thought. And maybe more pointedly, we might be the victims of this lawlessness in a deep way, particularly post Dobbs. And so I wanted to write a book that was essentially a love letter to the law and the rule of law, but also to these women that I profile in each chapter who just faced with insurmountable odds, particularly during the Trump era, whether it's Sally Yates, Becca Heller, Robbie Kaplan, Bridget Amiri, just forge on and win and win and win, because I want people not just to understand that the law is a thing that can help empower women, but that it's this second in history, it might be the only thing.
Yeah, I mean, so this second in history is what struck me. You discussed, there's a small army of women lawyers, but you talk about them as exploding into being. You sort of see the time lapse photography where all of a sudden 2016, the election, then boo, a real flourishing. So it's not simply that, by the numbers worked out to be a lot of women, but a real women driven, not even women driven, a reaction specifically among women who, as you put it, it's not simply even that they were answering a call. It was sort of more than that. Here, I'll read from the book. They were turning on a dime, upending their lives and their careers and their families to organize a new kind of resistance movement that would play in courthouses, state houses, and elections. And we'll get into courthouses, state houses, and elections, but a new kind of resistance movement and, exploding into existence. Talk a little bit more about that and, the seismic sort of origin point of the Trump election.
I think that a lot of this traces back, and I want to be clear because I think, look, you can't look at the Women's March. You can't look at the women organizing around the Kavanaugh confirmation. They knew they were going to lose. They showed up and they voted, by the way, in the midterms. So I don't want to completely hive off the women lawyers that I talk about in this book from just the larger women's movement that really, I think, sprung up to say, we're going to door knock, we're going to organize, we're going to postcard, we are going to do all this stuff. I think that they are two sides of the same coin. But my sense of it was, and again, these were all cases that I covered. You probably covered them too.
Yeah.
So these were all women that I was really struck, even at the time as I was covering them, by the ways in which they thought of themselves as ordinary, Harry. Like they just thought they were just regular attorneys. But in fact, they were like the closest thing we had to superheroes.
Right.
And I also was really struck by how, and many of them say this in the book, in interviews, they didn't think they were exceptional. They just had to do something different. So, Becca Heller thought she was way too young to be, getting IRAP ready to, stop the Muslim ban. Robbie Kaplan had no idea she was going to be fighting, Charlottesville Nazis and suing Donald Trump left and right. None of these people, I think, particularly, think about Sally Yates, but none of them thought this was coming. And many of them had to decide really, really quickly, like, I can't sit around and workshop this. This isn't normal. I have to do something. And maybe the coda to that I was really struck by, that's a through line in all of these, is not just that these women kind of leapt into the breach really quickly, but the ways in which, if you have a JD, and you have the ability to blue book, you can kind of change the world, Like you really can. It's not a trivial power.
Not too many have that latter ability, but somebody who has the ability to blue book, right? By the way, for listeners, that's just making sure your citations are picture perfect for a court. Sorry, Dahlia, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that at this moment particularly, when we feel so vulnerable, post-Dobbs, we feel, you're seeing women in Alabama who are
Yeah.
being literally held in prison and not able to leave for trivial offenses because the state has determined they're, going to endanger their babies if they leave. That knife edge between thinking the law makes us equal, the law affords us dignity and protection, and in a heartbeat, the law can be weaponized against you. It can literally be used to criminalize, your body, your choices, how you. And I think that this is in no way to say that men did not have this experience. And it is in no way, a comment on other vulnerable communities. But for me, I was really, really struck. Again, the book starts with, crowds chanting, "Lock her up," about Hillary Clinton. And you're like, wait, what? What was the crime again? Particularly at this moment, it's so poignant. What? She misplaced, she was on a private server. But, the idea that you could lock someone up without process, without charges, and that was the solution to her, and watching that ripple out to AOC and Nancy Pelosi and ripple out to Christine Blasey Ford when crowds were chanting that. And here we are. And it's September of 2022, and we are quite literally locking women up for endangering their pregnancies or for having miscarriages that seem sketchy to the powers that be. And so what I think that we have to really think about now is, like, we're not vulnerable because we have the law on our side. And as long as we have the law on our side, we do have this superpower. And so I think in some ways, and maybe this is to loop back to your original question,
Yeah.
the book is kind of a cri de coeur that we still live in a constitutional democracy, that despite some dings, the court system still exists to vindicate rights and dignity and privacy, and that there are people there doing that every single day. and that we really, really have to lift them up because the work that they're doing is essential.
I just want to stick with this for one more question that that spells it out pretty well. But again, it's this dramatic kind of origin story coming out of 2016. Many of the lawyers you showcase, I think you say yourself, have the kind of conservative white collar credentials of a Hillary Clinton. And so it's a very, I think, dramatic thing that they would suddenly change what they're doing and dive in. Now we now know, and you've mentioned it, repeatedly just in the last couple minutes, that it kind of worked out in terms of vulnerability and challenge to women from the legal system about as bad as it might have. Perhaps we could talk about that, but again, going back to 2016, is your sense of the way this small army, as you put it, came into being, was it something special about the vulnerability or the prospective vulnerability women felt? Was it something about this being the moment just of like seeing the law threatened and it being more sort of idealistic, and this is why I went to law school? What was made it specifically female, this eruption of a movement?
I guess I would say that for me, and at least my own sense of things, a lot of the people that I profile in this book were not willing to normalize that which was intolerable to them. And so whether it was putting kids in cages, whether it
Yeah.
was precluding migrants at the border who were otherwise entitled to abortions from having abortions, at each turn, there was a tendency to say, and I think you just said it really well, this system of law that's meant to be protecting us is in fact really, really not protecting us. And what are the tools I have in my toolkit that could remediate that? And I guess it's sort of a version of, and I remember you and I spoke right after Dobbs on your show, that a lot of people were shocked. A lot of people were really shocked that Dobbs happened. You know who
Right.
wasn't shocked? Women lawyers.
Yeah.
Most women lawyers who'd been watching what had been happening to the courts, what had been happening to the Roberts court, heard the oral arguments, listened to what happened after the leak, were not shocked at all. And so maybe there's a way in which I think my answer to you is a version of, we all are awake now, I think. Everybody's
Yeah.
awake. I think the women that I profile in this book were awake in 2016.
That puts it very really well, I think, and it puts me in mind of the Pete Seeger quote that is a prefatory to the book of just, I know one thing, the involvement connected me with good people, people with the live hearts, the live eyes, the live heads. Well, you've pretty well answered, I think, what my next question was going to be, which is how you chose your subjects, or at least what they had in common. I'll just invite you, if there's anything to add, whether what happened in that winnowing process. I assume some prospective subjects you wound up not doing, others you were driven to, but was it that metric of, you know, well, so go ahead. You have 10. I could, some of them are offbeat, I would say, and there maybe are others that one might have expected. How did you make your choices?
I mean, the truth is my initial list probably was 30 people, and
Yeah.
there were days when it was 50 people. And as I bumped along, if I covered a case, it would get added to the list. I think that one of the things I wanted to do was find the kinds of women lawyers that every 1L could see herself in that. And so I wanted to get, from the sort of foul mouthed, trash talking lawyer to the absolutely, dot all I's and cross all T's, super hyper conservative lawyer. And then I think as the book progressed, I mean, we should just say for folks who are listening, the last 3 chapters are all about voting and organizing.
Right.
And I started to realize maybe a version of what you're flicking at here, which is it's just not going to be enough to win in courtrooms. This is going to come down to massive structural democratic reform. And so in a sense, the book pivots I think, on Vanita Gupta's chapter, because
Yes.
it talks about that move from, in her own life, going from a civil rights attorney to a civil rights organizer when she went over to the leadership conference, and the ways in which you can win and win and win in the courts, but if you're not doing this essential work of, fixing vote suppression, fixing gerrymandering, all the stuff that is in the last chapters, then you can't win in the long run. And so I think one of the arcs and that helped me winnow was I wanted all sorts of different people. I obviously want to tell good stories. I think people at the end of the day just want to read good stories, and these are great, fun stories to tell. But I also wanted to move from a place of, in some sense, starting with Sally Yates, who is this lone, incredibly lofty figure at the Justice Department who says no to the travel ban on day one. And then kind of fanning out so that by the end of the book, you have these amazing coalitions of all of these leaders who come together to help Stacey Abrams, flip the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, and Nina Perales, who's doing unbelievable work on the ground trying to solve for reapportionment questions. And so I think what I really wanted to do was, and this is a big theme in the book, is take us from a place of the one lone hero narrative, which we're so in
Yeah.
love with, right? The guy with the white hat on the horse. And to say, underneath that hero, there are hundreds and hundreds of heroes. And as you say, some of the folks in this book people may not know. But I wanted to tell the story of how this doesn't happen because one person changes the world. It happens because massive, massive groups, in this case, groups of women and people of color, and other vulnerable groups organized together in the shadows. And so it was really important for me to land in the place where we all look around at each other at this moment in time, as I keep saying. And instead of saying, "Oh, I wish RBG were here," I sure wish, I hope Ketanji Brown Jackson can save us, look around and say, "I know who can save us, and it's me."
Yeah. I mean, this is so vivid in the book, and I want to talk at some length with Vanita, but on the one hand, at first, some of these women, I think, see themselves in the mold of previous civil rights lawyers who were largely men, and who today even, and those people, those lawyers, men and women, labor in the vineyards and get beat up a lot, and then win that one case, and then same thing, and then win that other case. And at least some of your lawyers here have a visionary quality of seeing, okay, great, but so besides that, a lifetime of stress and a little bit of amelioration of some people's problems. What have I done more broadly? And well, this is a good transition, I think, to a very important point in the book, which is. So implicit, it does come out a lot, I think, in the Vanita Gupta chapter, but implicit, I think, in the whole project is some sense that it matters that these profiles are women. Let me read. I maintain, this is Professor Lithwick. There's a special relationship between women and the law, and while one is loath to essentialize, I'll go ahead. This may be because law is the most conventional way with which to effect radical change. So, look, there seems to be an implicit thesis in many of the chapters and in the project that women have a special relationship, not just to the law, but to the how to achieve the goals of the law, more going outside the contours of the law as well. Is that fair? And if so, could you elaborate?
I think it's perfectly fair. And I think maybe I have 2 cuts at the answer. One is, I think that women, and boy, we saw this in the Dobbs opinion, Harry, were non-existent at the founding as a matter of law. They're not in the Constitution. In case anyone had any doubt, Justice Alito would like you to know.
You got a problem with that?
Yeah. And if you don't like it, vote. Except, by the way, we took away your right to vote. So
Yeah.
I think what I am trying to characterize here is, centuries of women, starting with Abigail Adams, right, imploring her husband to include women in his definition of freedom. He did not. Um, for centuries, women desperately trying to sort of braid their way into, the founding documents, into all of the amendments to the Constitution. Finally, not that long ago, achieving the right to vote, achieving, the right to have a credit card in your own name or to work in the profession of your choosing. It is such labor for women. And by the way, largely invisible labor. I mean, one of the reasons I start with Polly Murray, and we can talk about her if you want to, Polly Murray has been almost completely erased as a civil rights lawyer, even though Polly Murray did immense amount of work before other folks came along. And so that idea that you're having to claw power, claw dignity, claw the rule of law as something that you can use to protect yourself, and then have that sense that it can just be batted away because Justice Alito doesn't think you were there at the founding or that you had the vote at the founding, I think does make women have a very, very special relationship. And maybe it's just as simple as they can't or they shouldn't take it for granted that they're in the story at the beginning, that it was a fight, and that it's going to still be a fight.
Well, yes, but it strikes me there's more to it than that. But, I too don't want to essentialize. But isn't it fair to say that in addition to having a special kind of sense of mission born of, intolerable frustration in the past, there's a sense in which, women's, how can I put their way of approaching problems, their focus on broader relationships, if that's not too cliche-ish, but I think you'll know what I'm saying. It's not simply the force of will, but actually the force of approach and mindset that puts them in a special posture to possibly succeed and move things forward. Or is that not part of what you're wanting to say?
No, I think it's baked in, and I talk a lot about, I've been covering the Supreme Court for 20 years, and I watched when people tried to compare Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor and to say they both
Right.
had some kind of women's approach to the law.
Gumption
And
or something,
and
right?
I remember at the time really balking at that. And by the
Yeah,
way, Justice O'Connor hated that
yeah.
characterization. But one of the things that I was willing to say about the two of them is that they were really good at code switching. They were good at moving in and out of a man's world. And at the same time, very much aware of where they came from and the hardships they faced, and very, very susceptible to arguments that their colleagues couldn't hear because they hadn't had the experience. And, you remember maybe the most famous case of that was Savannah Redding, the strip search case of the high school student who was strip searched by school authorities. And all the men on the bench at oral argument, and I was in the room at the time, were like, ha ha, this is hilarious. It's just like gym class, ha ha.
Right,
Couldn't
right.
be funnier. And at that point, Justice O'Connor had left the court, so Justice Ginsburg was the only woman on the bench, and she just kind of came down like a hammer and said, both at oral arguments and then later in the press, while the case was pending, they have no idea what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl strip
Yeah.
search. It is not like being in gym class. And I think that is part of what I'm talking about, is that ability to inhabit two worlds, the ability to understand both what you have to do to succeed in a man's world, and Sally Yates really thinks about this a lot, but also that doesn't include the totality of life as it is. And that, this is one of the things that Sonia Sotomayor has been so magic about, is bringing to the forefront, even if it's in a dissent, the lived lives of people of color in this country, the lived lives of criminal defendants and death penalty defendants. So I think it's a way of saying, again, I guess to quote, this is Linda Greenhouse talking about Sandra Day O'Connor, they don't always know what they don't know, and these women know. And I think that they're in a position, and this is just to your end of your question, they're in a position to nudge things that way, to say, and this is the great hope of the book, actually, let me tell you a little bit about what it's like to be a 14-year-old girl who's being strip searched. And by the way, the men justices flipped their votes on that case. They ended up voting with Justice Ginsburg after she pretty much humiliated
Must
them
have
in the
been quite a
press.
conference.
Yeah.
Um, this may be overly facile, but I'm reminded of the civil rights era, and I clerked for Justice Marshall, and he could do it to that day. He actually had this fabulous. It was funny, but it also is exactly what you're talking about. He was able on a dime to go into Oxford English and have the perfect present, and that's not how he talked. In fact, he talked like a black man born in Baltimore around the turn of the century, but he knew, and it was essential to his success, how precisely to not let anybody knock the argument because faulting the bona fides of the messenger, as it were. And so he was extreme, and I think that's also true of the William Hastie or the great other trailblazers of the civil rights era. They knew, they actually sort of believed in institutions, so it wasn't simply that they were posturing, but they understood that institutions have institutional speech, institutional roles, institutional practices, and they were able to adopt them.
Can I
Um,
can I just say one thing to that? Because it
yeah,
goes so much to the hagiography around RBG, and obviously
yeah.
this book is written, in the shadow of the death of RBG, and everybody's casting around for the next one. And one of the things I find myself telling people all the time, I might even have said it before on your show, is that RBG was the most small c conservative civil rights attorney,
Yeah,
ever. And that not only did she talk in that voice and to present as
that
dainty
little
and
bird. Yeah,
decorous, but
right.
that she also literally crafted arguments to appeal to men. Like, she found male plaintiffs who were subject to discrimination because she didn't think that the three-judge panel she was talking to, all of whom were men, could possibly understand what it was like to be a woman and face discrimination. And so I think it is, in a deep way, exactly what you're saying, which is it's simultaneously having an aspiration of what freedom can be and what law can do, but operating in this system that can sometimes be so myopic. And I think the ability to do both those things is something that, rightly or wrongly, just comes more readily to the women lawyers in this book.
I have two quick personal shout outs, actually. The first is to my friend Julie Cohen, because she's the one who did the Notorious RBT, but also, and many people have heard of that, people probably haven't seen the movie on Polly Murray, who's a remarkable and very complicated figure in the civil rights era. And her movie, My Name is Polly Murray, is a really good introduction to both her, well, to her, among other things, huge contribution. And then my own dear old ma was in fact a few generations before, but she had the same kind of constraints. But so the ACLU versus Allegheny County, pretty landmark case in free exercise. She had it at the trial level and very, very carefully chose the plaintiffs. They weren't rabble rousers. There were ministers and other, and that's part of the litigator's art, both seeing a situation in facts, how it's going to play in law, including at the most, Olympian level, but also choosing the presentation, the story that will most appeal to who are, the current guardians of the institutional currency. All right, but well, actually, I just want to give you a chance. If you tell us, give us 30 seconds on Polly Murray here, because you mentioned her, and she's in the book as well. So
I also want to give 30 seconds on your mom, because I think that your mom really is the sort of high water mark of this characteristic that I keep finding in these women, which is just an immense, immense solicitude and respect for outsiders, right? Whether it's Black athletes facing discrimination, whether it's townspeople who don't want an overt Christmas display. Like, I do think there's something about being an outsider having been an outsider, and then becoming an insider that really is both embodied in your, how your mother did her career, but also I think some of the women in this book. Polly Murray, and we should be really careful to say if Polly Murray were alive today, they might want to be called they.
Yeah,
Uh,
we
be-
might be pronouns,
yeah,
right? Specific, right?
because very, very strongly felt herself to be a boy trapped in a woman's body, and was in anguish about it because was not living in a time where that was something that was understood or accepted. But Polly,
Including by enlightened civil rights lawyers, right?
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
was a bridge too far for them even, or so she felt.
Yeah,
He felt, whatever,
and,
right?
and Polly Murray, right, can't get into any school because
Yeah.
Polly Murray is black and can't get in, or because Polly Murray is a woman and can't get in, and so faces just relentless discrimination. Nevertheless, manages to have this extraordinary, I mean, by any metric, career. Refuses to move to the back of the bus long before Rosa Parks does, is desegregating lunch counters long before anyone else thought of it, ends up writing what becomes the spine of the brief in Brown v. Board that
Yeah.
is literally taken and used without crediting Polly Murray. To Justice Ginsburg's huge credit, Justice Ginsburg goes on to litigate one of her first civil rights cases and puts Polly Murray's name on the brief because it's so shocking that Polly Murray has been ignored. And the reason I'm obsessed with Polly Murray partly is because I saw the Julie Cohen documentary and was absolutely blown away by it, but also because I think it plays with some of the themes that I was playing with in this book about who gets famous and who doesn't, who gets remembered and who doesn't, who does the work and who doesn't. And one of the things that I'm very, very, very struck by in all the work I did pulling this book together, but also kind of covering the lawyers of the Trump era and beyond, is that there are so many women lawyers in the trenches doing the work without recognition. And that it's a model that's really interesting to me because I think, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, we're so susceptible to the Mueller's going to save us, and Jamie Raskin's going to save us, and whoever it is, Adam Schiff is going to save us. And I think that one of the things that I really learned from this book is that if you just kind of buy the tote bag and the mug and you tweet about your heroes, you're not necessarily like doing the work. And what I love about Polly Murray is that Polly Murray was this amazing combination of just endlessly, as you said, toiling in the vineyards, just getting the work done, long before anyone else does what becomes essentially the book that Thurgood Marshall uses to address discrimination, gets almost no credit ever, and then bounces on to the next thing, gets no credit. And that history has kind of more or less, with exceptions, right? Yale just renamed a residential college after Polly Murray, but doesn't have nearly the name recognition of some of the heroes that you and I, tweet about and think about every day. And yet, Polly Murray wasn't entirely self-effacing, right? Polly Murray writes to Richard Nixon and says, "You know who the first woman on the Supreme Court should be? Me." And I love that. I love that kind of blend of working away, toiling away in obscurity, getting the work done, not getting credit, but also just this ample self-confidence that, like, I know what the law is. I bet we could use the 14th Amendment to do some stuff, and then doing it. And for me, that's like the dream lawyer. And so many of the lawyers that I met over the last couple of years, but I profiled in this book, are some iteration of that personality.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of think of that as a traditional alpha male litigator kind of trait, and Robbie Kaplan, among others, displays it. In fact, so there's so many themes we could go with here, but what interests me most, and what I'd like to spend the rest of our time talking about, is this inside outside theme that and I think the inside outside, and then even inside outside, if you will, the combination of people is well illustrated by two folks. So Robbie Kaplan, who we've spoken, and the Charlottesville case, and Vanita Gupta, who we've also talked about. So let's spend a few minutes on each, if we can, starting with Charlottesville. And I want to just begin with your personal kind of relationship to that, Dahlia, because we'll talk a little bit, but the difficult both legal issue but also almost factual issue to get people to appreciate is the way in which a ostensible exercise in political speech not morphed into, but really was designed from the start to be an exercise in terrorism, basically. And what that meant was the complete uprooting and terrorizing of a town. And you lived that experience. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I had at that point in August of 2017 been living in Charlottesville for 17 years. Our children were born there, raised there. There was, one major synagogue in town that was kind of where everybody went, and that was the synagogue that Nazis were marching around saying "blood and soil" and "Jews will not replace us." And I think that you remember at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about, who was awake and who wasn't and what it
Yeah.
took to wake people up. I think that whole summer of 2017, if you lived in Charlottesville, there was, the first torchlit march that happened that spring. Then there was the Klan, then the Proud Boys came. Like it literally was that Blazing Saddles scene where like every white supremacist and Nazi was like driving through town. And nobody in Charlottesville that I knew was surprised that that exploded into what it became, leading not just, as you say, to horrific violence, but to the death of Heather Heyer and grievous injuries of others. And so it was a weird thing. I guess this goes to your insider-outsider point. I was still trying to convince my editors at Slate the day before that was happening, that it was happening, and that they were bringing guns and
Wow.
shields, and it was gonna be violent. And so when it occurred, when it turned into what it was, the thing that was shocking to the rest of the country, and you'll remember it was on a loop for days, wasn't all that shocking to people in town because we'd seen it building all summer. And also, and this goes to your First Amendment questions, I had been writing all summer about this line between First Amendment speech protection and the incitement of violence, and what do you do when they're bringing guns? And secondly, the Second Amendment is kind of crashing into First Amendment values. And why is it that all of our rules about incitement and violence come from 100 years ago? Like, these are really rich doctrinal questions. And I think one of the reasons that Charlottesville was such a shock to the country was shocking to me, who was sitting there watching it play out. And so maybe part of my answer, and it threads through so much we've talked about today, is that there was a sense, and it's not an accident, Harry, that Joe Biden begins his presidential run talking about Charlottesville, but there was a sense in which, oh, that was the beginning. But if you'd lived in Charlottesville that year, it was not the beginning. It had been
Yeah.
happening all summer. And maybe more pointedly, January 6th, which was another wake up call,
Yeah.
was the least shocking thing you could ever see if you'd lived through Charlottesville. And so I think one of the themes here is, how can you normalize, normalize, normalize to the point that you're shocked when the vapor trails are clear from the last one?
Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to mention is the very distinct overlap with January 6th. But sticking with our story, so enter Robbie Kaplan, who I'll just introduce along the themes we're talking about as someone who sees herself very much, at least in 2017, a traditional, well, going the same route as in previous generations men would in important big firms, and being a kick-ass, take no prisoners litigator, and Charlottesville. Discuss. So, give a little bit about the legal struggle, how she had to approach it, and how it ended up.
this was such a fun chapter to write, and I should disclose that, I know Robbie pretty well. Karen Dunn, who was,
Yeah,
co-counsel. I
my old
mean,
colleague. Yeah,
these 2 people are formidable, as you
yeah,
said. I mean,
I,
this is, call the showrunners. This is a hell of a movie. And one of the things that was so interesting was that they just came charging in and said, if the Donald Trump Justice Department were functioning as it should be functioning, this whole thing should be investigated and charged as a hate crime, right? I mean, they were pepper spraying and assaulting African American counter protesters. They were terrorizing African American neighborhoods. They were deliberately coming, these groups of white supremacists and Nazis, in
I just
order.
want to jump in here on one. All that is 100% right, and of course, if you're the Department of Justice, you very quickly reach the point that it took them years to get to, which is basically what we're finding out in all these things. The social media, the previous. So, yes, they were doing those things, but it was neither spontaneous nor innocent because they found quickly, as the department could have and should have, the paper trail that made it clear it was all a head busting
Yep.
of people of color
Yep.
operation.
Yeah, it was the Discord chats. I mean, and we knew this, right? I mean, this was stuff that the
Yeah.
Southern Poverty Law Center knew about. It was not, it shouldn't have been shocking to anyone, but exactly those Discord chats are the things that Robbie and Karen
Yeah.
were just determined to get their hands on. They got their hands on them. And this isn't a funny way of story. I mean, the trial didn't end until this past November. I think in some ways it could have and should have been one of those trials of the century, right? The Scopes monkey trial for Nazis and white supremacists. For reasons that, may or may not have to do with the fact that there weren't TVs in the courtroom. It didn't become the trial of the century, but they got a massive, massive civil judgment, bankrupted a bunch of Nazis and put a bunch of, I think, really important historical facts on the record. So for me, this is another one of those things where they won. I'm not sure why we didn't pay a little more attention, but maybe more pointedly, they set a template that's now being used to go after January 6th, people who committed acts of violence on January 6th under the Klan Act and what have you, and that it's not speech when you're in fact bludgeoning someone with a pole. So for me,
And that civil lawyers can go. I mean, really, these are ragtag, puffed up people, and you really get them where you bring them down if you go after the money. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, that's exactly it. And also, you tell a story about
Yeah.
great replacement theory, which Deborah Lipstadt testified to
Hmm.
unbelievably movingly at trial. And you tell a story about what justice means. And you tell a story about,
Yeah.
what it means to commit acts of racial justice and to incite violence against minorities. This stuff is really important. And so I guess,
Yeah.
when you asked me, these are groups, both women and people of color who are left out of the founding documents. They're invisible. What Robbie and Karen did in that trial was quite literally, I describe, like this act of weaving into the constitutional tapestry, the story of what it is to be Black and to be female and to be the victims of racial violence and of rampant anti-Semitism. And they made law and they changed the country. And for me, I think that is work that we just need to, when we sit around and we're like, oh my God, we're so screwed and the president's stealing nuclear
Yeah.
secrets and they're like at the buffet table in Mar-a-Lago. It's really important to look around and say, like, lawyers do really hard things and they win a lot and we just can't give up yet.
Yeah. And by the way, let me just add it. I mean, this truly is labor in the vineyard. I've done litigation. I still do some litigation. And the week to week reality of it, the sort of down and dirty, nasty little fights back and forth and taking no quarter and stuff. It's why people often don't like the law or don't even like lawyers, but they had to bring, because they're on they weren't in the Department of Justice, had to bring the litigators, the big shot litigators toolkit, and it ends very well. But the story, when the showrunners come and buy it, I can tell you for sure that 98% of the work will just go on, not be part of it because it's so friggin' boring, and that's what they do. But you tell a story too about Robbie Kaplan. So I'm interested. She starts out as a very conventional big firm. I think it's Paul Weiss,
Yeah.
right? Lawyer. And then her own story, she has her own evolution in the course of this. Explain what happened to her and where she is now.
Well, people will know Robbie Kaplan because Robbie is the person who brings the Edie Windsor case to
Yeah.
the U.S. Supreme Court, and that becomes the predicate. In striking down DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, it
Yeah.
becomes the predicate for Obergefell and marriage equality. And Robbie is another one of those characters who just lives in a lot of worlds, right? Because Robbie is gay and married to a
Married. Yeah.
partner whose marriage was not recognized, whose co-parentage was not recognized at the time that she brought Edie Windsor's case. And so Robbie too is toggling between being one of the most successful, right, commercial litigators at a fancy white shoe firm, and this whole life that she has, both as a woman and as a gay woman, and is trying, I think, constantly to kind of toggle back and forth between all of that reality. And Robbie very much was a person who would have probably been swept into a Hillary Clinton Justice Department. And yet, on a dime, when Clinton loses, just sets up Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, creates a new law firm out of a barn for the first couple of months. And then they're sitting there on folding tables, trying to figure out what they're going to do, knowing that they want to do a lot of pro bono work for civil rights and civil justice. And Charlottesville happens, and Robbie literally picks up the phone and says, "Let's sue some Nazis." And I
Yeah.
should be clear, that wasn't her area of expertise. But I think it's very much a story of, and I love that Robbie's in the book as an example of somebody who can succeed by every measure, even in the white shoe law firms, and still find a way to fight the worst excesses of Trumpism, right? Robbie still represents E. Jean Carroll. She still represents a bunch of plaintiffs suing Trump for other matters. And so I think
And
it's,
if I'm not mistaken, she still does a lot of standard commercial disputes that are the sort of meat and potatoes of Paul Weiss firms. I mean, that's the hybrid model. But rather than having that be the tail that wagged the dog, or whatever is the right way to put it, she's set up a true. She hasn't gone completely. It's a model where she pays the bills, and then but the revenue funds some really righteous stuff. Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think in a weird way, I hate using the word service because I think it absolutely obscures the work that so many of the characters in this book do. But it's a way to both serve justice and also sort of do justice and profit from justice. And I think, again, I look at Robbie as someone who I hope a whole lot of 3Ls look at that chapter and say, oh, there's a way to do this no matter what it is I end up doing as a lawyer.
All right, so now let's move to our friend Vanita Gupta. And again, I would want to focus on this inside outside idea, and both not just the person inside outside, but sort of inside the law and outside the law in terms of the broader mission or objective that brought them to law school. So Vanita has occupied very high level position. She's currently the third ranking person in the Justice Department with oversight of the whole civil docket and civil rights. And she's by all accounts a very important, what is sometimes a sort of two-person relationship at the very top is a triangle here by all accounts, involving the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, also the Deputy Attorney General and the Associate Attorney General. And her work has been reportedly very influential in a number of ways. You chronicle her time before when she was head of the Civil Rights Division, and let me just ask you kind of the Robbie Kaplan question. Having these strong traditional credentials and beginning to occupying an incredibly traditional job where, a lot of people have in the past gone in and wielded almost as big a club as you get and, knock people around. Vinita Gupta had, it strikes me, a somewhat different approach to this all. Um, can you just explain to listeners a little bit about who she is, what and how she fits into the thesis of here this comes up in the chapter. If women are, as I've argued, particularly adept at the practice of law, it almost goes without saying that they are also uniquely gifted at strategizing, organizing, and activating. And it's fitting that comes up in the Vinita Gupta chapter. Can you unroll that a little bit more, please?
Maybe what I would say is this. One of the things that shoots through this entire book is the part of it that I started calling Welcome to My Nervous Breakdown in 2016, which was essentially, what do you and I do when it starts to feel as though the machinery of the law is so corrupted that it can't do justice anymore, right? And I remember writing a very, very ill thought out piece the day Trump won the election, saying essentially everyone in the Justice Department should just step down. There is no
Hmm.
way to do this without being complicit. And that theme, and it comes up also in the Me Too chapters, it comes up in several places, of which of us is complicit, which of us is holding up an institution that is fundamentally broken and corroded to the point that it is only doing harm, is one of the things that's really interesting about Vanita. Because for me, and that's why I said this chapter for me is an inflection point in the book, because Vanita's entire career is being an outsider, suing the government, suing, whether it's a huge civil rights trial she does in Tulia in Texas, or
Right.
onwards throughout her career. What she does is take down what she thinks are unlawful government practices. And suddenly Eric Holder calls her up and says, you want to come work for me? And she does what so many of the characters in the book do, which is like, what, who, me? Like, you want me to be like, at the table with the big dogs? And it's funny because it's so um prevalent, like, that everybody has that moment of, Becca Heller talks about it too, of self-doubt. But she goes in, and then I think, very quickly after she does amazing work under under the Obama Justice Department, she comes out and now she's kind of been on both sides, right? She's both been suing the government, but she's been also, doing amazing, like, for instance, police reform and policing reform, criminal justice reform from the inside. And I love her as a character because having done both of them, and it's another one of those, right? Code switching, another split screen, where
Right.
now she's really adept at thinking about systems from the inside, systems from the outside. How do you work within a system that feels as though it is not serving without cratering the system altogether? And I love her as a character for some of the reasons that I love. Anita Hill talks about this later on in the book. We have to fight for the rule of law, even though we know, it was born out of racist, misogynist, awful, awful impulses and imperatives, because there's nothing else. There's nothing else. And so what we do is we go back to the trenches and we work on it and we fix it. And it's so, for me, particularly at a moment like this, where I'm sure your friends who teach con law are saying the same thing to you this fall. I cannot teach con law anymore because I don't know what the hell happened at the Supreme Court last term, but it can't possibly be that it's just like a magic 8 ball, that's con law and it's whoever has power. I love that in that uncertainty about systems and institutions, Vanita is kind of the quintessential, yes, it sucks. It's racist. We over incarcerate. Chattel slavery is the original sin. It's awful. And also, it's fixable. Here's how we fix it every single day. For me, I don't know as lawyers, how you can get up in the morning unless you have that attitude. It's so hard for me, and so many of the women in the book land where Vanita lands, and I just, like, I cling to that because my sanity lies in that.
And it's she gets a lot done, and she winds up saying it's not enough. It's never enough. You're always, but still. Well, that prompts one question I wanted to ask, and then I want to bring it fast forward to the future, but I mean to the present. But it's an open secret that most litigators are ambivalent about their jobs day to day at best, including the big success stories. It is a stress fest and a cluster F, and it gets pettier. And if but do you think your subjects, the ones you chose, are relative to peers in the law happy?
Wow, that's a hard question. I think that, and I really learned this in the Trump era, and I've reread Viktor Frankl a bunch of times. I think that they would talk less in terms of happiness, Harry, than purpose.
Hmm.
And I think that what they really, each of them in different ways, characterizes as there's a mission. There's a thing I have to do. And it isn't the Netflix movie, right? There isn't the, like,
Yeah.
you know, "Oh, now we're gonna do we're in the library and we're flipping papers and the next day we're in court," there's no, like, slow motion musical montage of doing law. It's, as we said about Robbie Kaplan, that case took years. So, I think happiness is not the metric. I think for them, and, arguably these are all sort of different kinds of cases and different kind of projects. And, in the case of gerrymandering or voter registration, it's a whole other enterprise. But I think what they would say is that they have purpose, that they really have meaning, and that, I don't know, maybe happiness is a luxury at a moment when it feels like constitutional democracy is crumbling. But I just get the sense that they get up every morning and that they know they're doing a thing, and that the thing could change everything. And for so many of us who are just kind of feel like we're in a blender where it's like the highs and the lows, and it was like a bad day at Mar-a-Lago, good day at Mar-a-Lago, who knows what Judge Cannon's going to do tomorrow, and it's crazy making, there's real utility in watching the progression of somebody who has purpose.
I'm tempted to stop here, and maybe we will, but because that was so perfect. But I want to go for a few more minutes, and then we might. But so I'll just say that this is a whole detour we can't take. But this is a whole detour. But the literature on happiness talks about exactly this as sort of being half of the big equation. The other half involving more ephemeral things. But the sense of mission and purpose, I'll also say, is a real luxury or way too rare in the law. So many people go to law school and wind up doing work that they may find challenging, but they can't pour their heart into, in the sense of deeply caring which side wins. And to be in a different kind of practice, I'll invoke my mom again, is really it's the most fortunate of lawyers' jobs, I think. All right. Final question, Daya. So you've several times you rewrite the final three chapters because of Dobbs, and you've even as I've asked you questions about 2017, you have fast forward insistently to today and the aftermath of that notorious decision. Can you just kind of give a sense of how the meaning of the book or the project either broadened or took deeper root as a result of Dobbs, and where we really are today?
Yeah, and this is I think the question, because in some sense I thought at times I was just writing a triumphal book of ancient history. Look at all
Right.
the lawsuits Donald Trump lost. And then as I worked through the material, and as we both have said, started to grapple with structural problems. What do you do with the malapportioned Senate? What do you do with an electoral count act? What do you do with, gerrymandered districts? What do you do about, Kansas and Michigan and women voters who are just like, no, I don't agree to this, and yet can't necessarily effectuate their will. And so I think one of the things that I realized that for me was the point, and the book was almost done when I realized the point, and maybe that's how the journey always goes,
Yeah.
is that if you're not thinking about gerrymandering, if you're not thinking about reforming the Electoral College or Senate reform, or, I mean, we could talk about this for a whole other show, but the reform of the judiciary, you're going to get dobbsed again and again and again. And by the way, we got dobbsed 7 times last year. We just didn't pay enough attention because we were all watching Dobbs. And so I think, again, maybe it just takes me back to where we talked about in the middle of the people who were just seismic shock that a Supreme Court can, with the stroke of a pen, do away with 50 years of freedom and liberty, and with a stroke of the pen say, New York, you don't get to set your own gun rules. How did that happen? Nobody wants that. That's not in the doctrine. What happened? And that's when you really have to have these conversations about how your vote is counted and why red state, gerrymanders have proven so incredibly both effective, but also just catastrophic for getting what you want. And so I think that there's a way in which, for me, the book ends on this note, and it does end with the Stacey Abrams. It does end with, redistricting and malapportionment, because I think you have to talk about structures and processes. And it's just, again, the Netflix movie is never about gerrymandering reform, right? It's the Clarence Darrow story. It's not the organizers in the trenches who are working incredibly, incredibly hard to get names on a, ballot petition. And so I think where I wanted to land is exactly where we find ourselves in this instant, which is, particularly if you're a woman, you probably had the shock of your life this June and July, and now you're living with the sense that we're down a hole we can't dig out. And that's why I think, for me, the book ends with these women who are like clawing back power. They're like, abso-freaking-lutely not. We can get out, and we just have to do the work. And by the way, Pauli Murray was doing this work. And by the way, amazing women both inside and outside the system and inside and outside the legal profession have been doing this work for a long time. And so for me, I want it to be a little tiny bit of one of those like electric shock, like cardio, like, ha, we can do this. Our heroes are all around us. But I also really want, for the folks who didn't quite understand how we got this Supreme Court, to see that happened in plain sight. And that if we don't think really hard about, the independent state legislature case that's coming, if we don't think really hard about these gerrymandering cases that are coming, it's going to happen again. So in a sense, it's just broadening the aperture from, it's very easy to love RBG. She weighed 8 pounds and she could bench press like both of us. And it's like a fun story, but it's not power. This is, to me, a book about broadening that out to turn it into not just power, but like achievable power, and the kinds of things we have to do and think about, and the kinds of work we have to support in order to get there.
The book is Lady Justice: Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. The author, Dahlia Lithwick. It's available everywhere now as you hear this podcast. Dahlia, thanks so much for being with us today.
Harry, thank you for having me.